how do we get beyond overgeneralizing and actually sympathizing and empathizing, where we can actually listen to the heart of our brothers and our sisters, going beyond those stereotypes, realizing that there are stereotypes, but not allowing it to lead towards racism and prejudices and assumptions, where we're already making assumptions about a culture or about a person.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. This podcast features stories of Canadian church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or someone just wanting to learn more, we pray you get inspired to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. We pray this is a blessing to you, and if it is, we would ask you to share links to episodes, subscribe on whatever platform you are using. With that, let's get to our next conversation. Friends, welcome back to the Sowers Podcast, or maybe this is you for the very first time joining us. A special welcome to you. It's good to have you listening in to a conversation that will hopefully inspire you to become a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. That you be someone that shares the gospel in word and deed in each of those environments with the people that you are spending time with on a consistent and on a regular basis. Well, I want to invite you, as I generally do, to engage with us by emailing ask@thesowerspod.ca or through Instagram @thesowerspod or on X. I'd love to hear from you if you have any suggestions or referrals as far as future guests. If you'd like to share a story of something that has stood out to you from past conversations on the podcast, things that have equipped you, encouraged you, challenged you, or maybe you've had the opportunity and you've taken the opportunity, encourage to share the gospel with someone. I would love to hear that as well. This may be something that we'd be able to share in a future episode if you'd be willing to do that. So why don't you go ahead and engage with us in that way? Well, today you're going to hear a conversation that I had with Nate Vedoya. Nate is the planting pastor of Church in the Valley in Edmonton, Alberta. He also serves as the Send City Missionary in the city of Edmonton. That means he's coordinating work in ministry for the CNBC and for the Send Network in the city of Edmonton. He's a colleague of mine. I think you're going to enjoy listening to this conversation. Nate and I by no means have arrived at full conclusions, but what we're doing today is engaging in a conversation about pursuing the life of a multi-ethnic and multicultural church. And so without further ado, here is that conversation with Nate Vedoya. Well, hey, Nate Vedoya, welcome to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for taking the time to sit in and spend this time in conversation with me.
Dude, it's my honor, my joy, my pleasure.
I'd love to get you to share a bit up front here, some of your personal background, and then calling to the pastoral vocation and work.
Yeah, born and raised here in Canada, specifically Winnipeg, Manitoba, the heart of the continent. It really is the heart of the continent. So born to immigrant parents from the Philippines. They immigrated here in the late 60s and 70s. True story. They actually met and married here in Canada. So it's one of the rare things that I get to talk about. But I've been married now for the past 24 years to my beautiful wife, Adele. Everyone calls her Deen-Deen. We have 3 amazing kids, Karis, 21, Malachi, 19, and Jasmine, who is 15. And again, that in itself is a story. Yeah, currently serving as the Send City Missionary here in Edmonton. And for those of you who don't know what a Send City Missionary is, basically I get to work with church planters across Edmonton, discovering, developing, and deploying them. And because I have so much time on my hand, Matt, I just can't help but plant a church. And I call our church, a Church in the Valley is my R&D department. It's my research and development. It's my playground where I get to kind of try different things. So in a nutshell, that's kind of myself.
So tell us a little bit about Church in the Valley. You said this is kind of your R&D, but at what point did you feel the calling of the Lord to plant Church in the Valley?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Even just going back, church planting has kind of been a part of our DNA. Ever since I was born, my family has been a part of church planting in Winnipeg, mostly ethnic churches, Filipino churches. We started off in Winnipeg. My parents migrated out to Calgary, and that's where my parents were called into the church planting ministry. So they attended the seminary in Cochrane, And then they planted the first Filipino church here in the Edmonton area. So again, over the course of my life, that's kind of been a part of our DNA. And so I've been exposed to that. And then just about 7 or 8 years ago, back in the Edmonton area, actually we moved back to Edmonton about 11 years ago. And honestly, man, I thought I was done with church planting. That's another story in itself. But we were church planting in Winnipeg. And man, Winnipeg's a great place to be born in and to come from, but to go back to that city was such a challenge on so many different levels. And so when we moved back to Edmonton, God again just kind of pricked our heart. We saw the opportunities, we saw the need, and we said, okay, well, based on the stuff that we've experienced, what would it look like for us to plant a church, number one, bivocationally, right? We weren't going to take an income actually from the church. What would it look like to develop a team around us? And then, of course, engage our community, so forth and so on. And so, again, that was like, what, 9 years ago? So bivocation was still a buzzword. It wasn't really, it's just something that was still emerging. And so, again, over the course of 9 years, we've just learned what it was like to push hard to work bivocationally. But really, the calling was to build a church that was a third culture church, a third culture that goes beyond our cultures, our ethnic cultures, our linguistic cultures, and then establish a culture that would love and serve our community beyond our own comfort zone.
I'd love for you to dig into that a little bit, Nate. What do you think the barriers are to developing a church like that, a multi-ethnic church, particularly with the background of coming from an ethnic church, a predominantly, from what you've said, a Filipino environment?
It's challenging, I think, and I think I've heard and I've read a lot of different things, and one of the things they say is start from the get go, right? If you're going to build a multi-ethnic church, you need to have a multi-ethnic team. You want the team to reflect the community from the get go, and so again, it gives you a little bit more, building that culture so that you have that ramp leading up towards a more diverse congregation, but. But the transition in monoethnic church to multi-ethnic church can be super challenging. And again, we have to understand that different cultures will have their different challenges, right? When I look at, for example, the Filipino culture, Filipinos are very different from other Asians, right? We're not like Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. Filipinos have they were colonized by Spain for almost 300 years. And so people often, tease that the Filipinos are like the Mexicans of of Asia. We have the last names, we're similar in stature, and even in culture, we have some similarities. And English actually is wide spoken in the Philippines. And so for us to transition from a monoculture into a more multi-ethnic culture isn't as challenging, right? We can integrate well within the culture, but it's when we actually step out and help our young people to transition into more of a multi-ethnic missionary mindset is where the challenge comes.
So you said there that the transition for helping our young people step out into the missionary environment. So can you dig into that a little bit more? Is that motivated by the next generation will do it more easily than your generation and your parents' generation?
Absolutely. Like when you look at the first generation, so when I look at first generation, these are the first immigrants that have come to Canada. And those who came maybe as teenagers, like my wife, would be considered 1.5, and then myself would be second generation. So although, I grew up here in Canada, I very much, grew up in a Filipino home. And, interestingly enough, I didn't learn Tagalog growing up. That's the main language. In fact, I grew up in a predominantly Caucasian school, Mennonite school, where I was forced to learn German and French in elementary school. So even before I learned how to speak Filipino, I was learning, French and German. And so again, there's those factors that contributed to who I am personally speaking. But again, we have these Filipino cultures in our home, but then we're integrating into a more, multi-ethnic environment or predominantly Caucasian environment. And we live between the tension of both worlds, right? And so that in itself forces us to become adaptable. We have to learn how to innovate. We have to learn to be like chameleons. We're always adjusting. We're always accommodating whatever host culture we might be in. And I think that in itself lends itself to more of this missionary mindset. When God really grabs a hold of a person's heart, it's already in their DNA where they're able to transition between different cultures. So that's what I see with a second generation, ethnics growing up here in Canada. But again, the challenge is how do we help the first generation to, to, to again embody that desire to send out that next generation as missionaries to reach their community.
Well, I'm thinking about a recent interview that I did with JD Fasolino, and he's reaching Hispanics, and he was talking about the integral importance of reaching first generation so that you can have the opportunity to reach second and third generation. And so what's your perspective on that? Certainly you've seen second and third generation come to Christ for the first time without having reached the first, but how do you balance those two things in the life of a church?
Yeah, man, it is again, different cultures will have different challenges. Like I worked in the Chinese church environment for about 8 years, and so I worked with Mandarin and Cantonese. I've worked with Korean churches as well, and so I got to observe the culture from my position as the English pastor, and I could see again the tensions between the generations. And if you're taking, for example, a Chinese or Korean congregation, or even Japanese for that matter, you have your typical model where you have the mother church, which is the Cantonese church. Again, it's all done in Cantonese, and then you'll have maybe a ministry of that, which would be the Mandarin congregation. And then you would have the English congregation, right? And that's where the kids are funneled from both the Cantonese and Mandarin to form an English church or English ministry. So that English ministry, it starts off as a ministry of the church, but as the kids are being discipled and as they're growing in their faith and they're serving within their context, eventually that really does become a Bible church. These young people are not going to stay young their entire lives. They're going to become professionals. And you know how, I don't know if you know how it is in the Asian culture, but they're always pushing towards academic excellence, right, and career stability and comfort and whatnot. And so we see a lot of young people, leaders in their workplaces, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, lawyers, but within the context of their own church, they'll always be seen as a ministry, kind of subservient to the mother congregation or to the other congregations. And again, that becomes a challenge where they're no longer they can't take ownership of the church. And any suggestions would have to go through a series of vetting and voting. And it can just be so laborious where the young people of that congregation just feel like, you know what, I think it's time to move on, right? So that's been the challenge. And when you think about it, Matt, that's actually a form of segregation. Instead of really integrating them into the congregation of the church, you're just saying, okay, we're going to separate you here, we're going to separate you here. And, essentially you're going to, line up with what we see as the vision and the mission and the value of the church. And so that's the challenge I've seen in that kind of culture. And in the Filipino culture, we don't do that as much. It's more integrated. Even though English is not their first language, they still preach in English. They struggle with it. It's Taglish. And interestingly enough, Matt, if you're talking to like a Filipino and you're speaking to like a first generation Filipino in English, and if you're just going on and off, they'll look at you, they'll look at you. And there's a saying, in Filipino, they call it nosebleed, right? In other words, they're trying to process everything that the Canadian speaker is saying to the point where it gives them a headache. And so they'll just inevitably go like, I don't know what you're saying. I'm going to nod. I'm going to agree. But again, in the Filipino culture, we're more integrated. And again, the challenge there is that they just form their own little ghetto, right? It's just its own Filipino Canadian ghetto. And they don't, if not given a vision for the second generation to reach their community, right? The Jerusalem, Judea, the Samaria, end of the world mindset, they're just going to stay within their own little bubble and develop their own little culture. It'll always be inward looking. And so that's what I've seen typically coming out of cultures like that. Like Spanish culture is very similar to Filipino culture. You'll see that maybe likewise in Indonesian culture, where they just kind of all integrate. Sometimes within the Vietnamese church, they'll have that separation as well. But for the most part, I've seen them also integrate. East Indian, I see them integrate. Now I've seen a couple of African churches where they're trying to take the next step to establishing an English ministry instead of just having them all integrated. But therein lies again issues and problems within every context.
Let's just use a gathering, a service as an example. I think that there are a number. I certainly, when I was pastoring a local church, I had the desire that we would become more of a multi-ethnic community. But I would say that there was a whole host of things. And now that I'm working in an environment where I'm working with many different cultures and many different ethnic backgrounds, I've come to realize how negligent I was as a white pastor pastoring a predominantly white congregation, that I don't even think I would have known what I would have needed to change in a service to have been able to honor other people's cultures and ethnicities. So I love what you said earlier, where we need to have, if we can, have a diverse leadership team. But let's just use the example right off the bat here of a worship service. What is a way to form a multi-ethnic, what would be if there is an average multi-ethnic worship service?
I've seen different examples of that, even within the African culture, right? I mean, we look at the skin and we think and assume that it's just one culture, but there's multiple languages being spoken. And so, like, I've seen them attempt to, just really integrate everyone into that service. You'll have translators, you'll have, the lyrics in different languages and different expressions. And I think that can also be a challenge as well, because everyone, like, they truly want to worship in their heart language. It's so different. So, like, case in point, this weekend, the women here in Alberta had a conference in Red Deer Overflow, and there was about 350 women that attended. It was amazing. My wife, Deen-Deen, was one of the keynote speakers, and she just tore it up. God just really used her. But one of the things they did at the conference during their breakout is they actually broke it into different language groups. So they had one for like a Chinese breakout, and then they had one for Filipinos and so forth and so on. And of course, Filipinos was like the most attended breakout, and they did it purely in Tagalog, which was like a first for them. And not only that, but my wife helped to facilitate that conversation. But there was just so much pride, right, and joy, good pride in having them do this in their heart language. They actually started the session out by singing the Philippine national anthem. It was so funny. My wife showed me the video, but I'm like laughing. But at the same time, it helped me to realize the importance of still valuing your culture and the importance of hearing it in your language. It just hits you differently, right? And so I think so many times we're trying to force something that might not be there. I think there might be special times when we gather together, with multiple cultures, and we have a special celebration. But with the first generation, okay, let's start there. I think everyone needs to realize there's a lid to a first generation, right? Whether it's the immigration lid or whether it's a saturation lid, because you have so many churches already of a very similar culture. And so we have to understand what the lids are, but it doesn't exempt a church from still being missional. They still have to have a missional mindset, whether they're praying for the mission, whether they're supporting the mission, whether they're training people from within and sending them out. But I just don't think that all monoculture churches will be able to transition to multi-ethnic. And when I say monoculture, I'm not just talking skin culture, or I'm not talking language or cultural linguistically. I'm also talking like predominantly a Caucasian culture. But again, it doesn't exempt us from being missional, from sharing the gospel with our neighbor, from connecting with our coworkers. And so again, that's helping first generation churches see that the church, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the church isn't the end goal, right? It's the kingdom of God, as we've been talking about here with our churches. It's not your church, if you're operating in isolation and you're siloed from the rest of the community or from the kingdom, you're not operating with that missional kingdom mindset.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Nate Vedoya in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know a little bit about the work of Send Network in Edmonton. The capital of Canada's Alberta province is Edmonton, and it lies along the curving North Saskatchewan River. The population has grown by 160,000 in the past 10 years. The swell in numbers has been attributed to an increase in student attendance at the area's dozens of universities and post-secondary institutions, as well as an influx of workers from China, India, the Philippines, and other parts of Canada who found employment in the city's thriving oil business. Though the number of people in general is growing, the percentage of those who follow Jesus is not. And it is this statistic that makes Edmonton an ideal ministry target. As Canadians and immigrant populations move to the oil capital of Canada for fortunes or for higher learning, it's the church that needs the foundation laid for another type of future growth. This is why Nate Vedoya, the Send City Missionary, hopes to see local leaders and business owners join forces and be part of the vision and ministry efforts in the city. And he says we're looking for partners from other places who will join us in reaching Edmonton for Christ. If you'd like to learn more about Send Network's vision for the city of Edmonton, you can visit the link in our show notes. And now back to my interview with Nate Vedoya. Yeah, I think that's really helpful, a point of clarification, to not simply separate things racially or ethnically, but more so maybe you'd put it as a culture of worship. In the similar way that if I think about, how the average, Baptist church functions on a Sunday morning versus the average charismatic church functions on a Sunday morning, and their particular worship service and their liturgy. And I think it's not just sort of high churches, mainline churches that have liturgies. We have liturgies within evangelical Protestant churches as well. But within those environments of more of a charismatic church or traditional Baptist church, hands raised, hands to your side, a little bit of swaying. You're going to have probably different cultures represented or different ethnicities represented in that room based upon their background. So that's an interesting thing to have there. What would you say are some of the, we'll use the term sacred cows that regardless of your background would be similar across both ethnic and cultural differences?
Respect is huge, especially amongst the Asian culture, right? Where you're coming from an honor shame background. And again, for us as in the roles that we play, we have to be very mindful of the cultures that we are engaging with. Like for example, African or even Native First Nation, Native American, they come from this power, worldview framework. Whereas again, Asian is really a lot of honor and shame. And so I'll speak to that. And so likewise, like in the Asian culture, you'll see them bowing a lot, right? It's this humbling of themselves to another person out of respect. In the Filipino culture, we do something called mano po. So you take the hand, the right hand of the elder, and you take it to your forehead, and you're asking essentially for their blessing. So that's a big part of I think Asian culture, right? Is that respect, and honoring of the parents. And the second generation and third generation, growing up here in Canada, there can certainly be a disconnect, right, with what they are seeing. And I've wrestled through that too, Matt, but I've also come to understand how important it is to that culture to demonstrate and show that level of respect to our elders. A huge one, I think, that comes to mind.
Yeah. Does anything else come to mind, again, that would be across cultures, across ethnicities, that would be sort of sacred cows that, again, thinking of Moses comes back down from the mountain. These people have created this calf and they're worshiping it. What are some of the things some of the calves that we need to see smashed, regardless, or stereotypes, like stereotyping other cultures or ethnicities?
I've thought about this a lot too, Matt, and like I've had conversation with my Caucasian brothers and sisters, and this has been a big conversation, especially during the pandemic, with the rise of the BLM movement down in the States, and of course, we've also been affected here in Canada for sure, and then of course with the Asian hate, right? That was again going all around the States, and I think, and likewise in Canada, and I think it's important that we understand that stereotypes come from somewhere, right? I mean, that's why they're called stereotypes. Maybe we overgeneralize, but there's a reason why we stereotype, and it's because it's actually very common. Filipinos love rice. Okay, I mean, we're not gonna deny that. And like realistically, other Asian cultures don't eat as much rice as Filipinos. It's just that's for us. If there is no rice, it's just a snack. Man, you could be dishing out the most like incredible buffet with everything under the sun. But if there's no rice, it's a snack. Okay, it's just an appetizer. And so there's a reason for stereotypes, but I think beyond that, right? Like how do we get beyond overgeneralizing and actually sympathizing and empathizing, where we can actually listen to the heart of our brothers and our sisters, going beyond those stereotypes, realizing that there are stereotypes, but not allowing it to lead towards racism and prejudices, and assumptions, where we're already making assumptions about a culture or about a person. Every culture has stereotypes. Within every culture, you hear racism and prejudice comments. It's you hear bigotry in every culture, right? It's just, do you understand what they're saying? And so in the Filipino culture, we do see that as well, right? Whether it's in reference to other cultures, whether it's in reference to people within, the Filipino culture itself. So how do we break that, right? How do we break those stereotypes? We value the color of a person's skin. Let me just give that example. Like, you'll often hear people say, "Well, I'm colorblind. I don't see color." Well, no, that's not true. We have different colors, and there's a reason why God has made us the way we are, and we need to celebrate the diversity of our cultures. I think there are things within every culture that needs to be dismantled and broken, as you mentioned earlier. But there's certainly certain things that God has placed in those cultures that we need to celebrate, uh, unearth, or pull out, and again honor. And so I think it's important that we really learn to listen and sympathize. I was talking to an Eritrean pastor the other day. Eritrea, I don't know if you're familiar with Eritrea, Matt. It's right above Ethiopia, and Matt, I'm learning so much about Africa. Truth be told, I'd say about 10 years ago, I knew nothing really about Africa. I just knew it was this huge continent, and I thought everyone was similar, right? Like, I don't know if you ever watched Shaka Zulu growing up. That was like my frame of reference for Africa, or watching Madagascar, right, with your kids. But as I got to learn more about my brothers and sisters in Africa, I realized how incredibly multicultural Africa really is, from tribe to tribe, from country to country. It's so multifaceted. And so I'm talking to this Eritrean brother who's Eritrea, just north of Ethiopia, and English is not even his second language, Matt. It's like his fifth or sixth language. The dude speaks Arabic fluently. He reads Arabic. He speaks Ethiopian, Amharic, Arabic, and then I think he also speaks French, right? Like, just so many languages. And I'm trying to capture everything he's sharing with me, and so I'm taking notes. But I'm like, you know what? Let's try Google Translate. And so I'd have him, text me everything in Eritrean, and that translated over to English. It's not perfect, but I was able to capture the context of what he's really wanting to communicate with me. And then vice versa, I'd respond back in English. He'd translate it into his language, and you could just see his eyes pop, because now we're understanding each other, right? And I think, again, if we say that we're colorblind, we're not valuing, who they are as a person, their culture, and what they bring to the table. And so if we're able to go the extra mile, which is that third culture mindset, we're moving beyond, our, culture of ethnicity. We're moving on beyond the culture we're growing up in. And we're saying all of these things contribute to us being, missionaries in our culture, bridging the cultural gaps, the socioeconomic gaps, so that we can, bless people with the gospel.
Why do you think it's become so difficult to have conversations related to race, ethnicity, and culture? Because it just seems, and I mean, this is maybe, I think lots of people would say, maybe like there's increased polarization. Certainly social media has played a part in algorithms and things of that nature. People have always historically held polarized, or views that are polarized from another view, but we certainly, they're highlighted more. But why do you think it's become so difficult to even have a conversation like the one we're having, and be okay with stumbling over our words and maybe making some of those assumptions, but then being corrected, showing grace? What's this all about?
I think people are just so tense these days. I mean, you see it everywhere, right? Again, coming out of the pandemic, you see this heightened anxiety all over the place. And I remember one speaker a few months ago, again, in observing, the results of the pandemic, you see heightened anxiety, and then anxiety leading to anger, right? And anger can either be expressed in depression or in aggression, right? Like, and so we're seeing a lot of aggression happen all around us. Have you seen the new Jack Reacher TV series?
I have not, but
No, or even the latest the beekeeper. Anyway, there's these vigilante justice guys, right? And these TV shows have really shot to the top of the ratings. And I think it's because they're doing what we want to do. You know what I mean? They're going around exacting vigilante justice, punching out doors and knocking people out and blowing up buildings, right? Because there's this sense of injustice. And so again, coming out of all that, it's just like you said, it's heightened. There's so much injustice in the world around us, and we don't know how to address it or how to react to it. We get so easily offended when it comes to areas that are very personal to us, right? I mean, or to comment about your kid or your mustache, you're gonna be like, oh yeah, you get so offended. But how do we actually move beyond that, where love really becomes the framework for where we're listening, where we're hearing, and we can have, like you said, engage in these healthy conversations. And again, it's not like it's new. This has been happening ever since the first century, right? Within the church, we've seen how, again, multi-ethnic the early church was, and the Holy Spirit had to come in and help them to have a common language in order for them to to work together. And then at the same time, he sent them out, dispersed them into all the nations. So without the gospel, and that's really what the third culture is about, right? The third culture is about embracing a Christ culture. It's not about forming your own culture. It's a Christ culture that has the mindset to go beyond your own comfort zone into your Judeas, into your Samarias, and to the outer ends of the world. And that's where we begin to see the miracle of the gospel really happen.
what do you think some of the commitments of that third culture needs to be? And they're probably gospel commitments, but what do you think some of those commitments of that third culture needs to be?
Humility. I mean, that's it. Humility. We talk about it as pastors and preachers and teachers. We've read books on it. I hear people often quote Andrew Murray and other great CJ Mahaney wrote the book on humility, and then a few years later, he kind of got the axe for that. But I think if this became a reality for me, probably in my 30s, Matt, and this is something that I try to teach our young men, even within our congregation, if they can begin to build and learn this at an early age, right? Like true humility is not thinking about yourself, right? C.S. Lewis, right? He's often quoted, it's not just thinking, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less, right? And then, Keller says it's not thinking about yourself at all. Like, how do we get to that true Philippians 2 Jesus humility, where we serve the community around us, where we care? And so those are the things that I think is foundational to any Christian, right? Gospel witness. But that's how I kind of gauge whether or not someone's moving toward the third culture mindset, is if they have this heart and mindset to let go of certain things that they think are important to them. And so that's huge, I think.
Yeah, I think there's the other element of grace. Not too long ago, we were in a church predominantly Korean, and you probably know this about Korean prayer, that when Koreans invite people to pray, they're inviting everybody to pray at the same time. Most of the white churches that I've been in were very ordered about prayer. So who's praying first? Who's closing? Who's finishing off? We very much are very ordered. So I was participating in a prayer meeting with the group. And so they said, okay, and now we're all going to pray about this. I just sat there and nobody else was praying. So I thought, oh, people are kind of quiet tonight. So I started praying and then ended praying. And then, okay, then there's the next section. Okay, everyone, now we're going to pray about this. And again, nobody's speaking out loud. So I go, okay, I don't mind. I'll pray out loud. And then I look at the group and they're all kind of snickering and laughing. And so when it all ended, they said, Matt, why did you pray out loud? And I said, isn't that what we were supposed to do? And they said, no. And then we discovered their normal or their standard was not the standard that I was accustomed to. But within that, I felt that there was at least a safety that they gave to me and I gave to them. And there was a grace that went, oh, and they could actually be self-aware. Whereas before they weren't self-aware about that fact. And afterwards, they became self aware, and there was a mutual grace that was extended to one another. I wasn't offended that they called me out on it, and they weren't offended that I was praying out loud when I should have been praying silently alongside everybody else.
Korean prayer is so cool, right? I remember the first time I heard it, like, I think I was like 19, so like 25 years ago. And it was like thunder, right? You just hear, and then, I tried to bring that back to Canada when I came back to Canada. So this was in the Philippines. And, we're trying to, pray Korean style, but it's so challenging, right? In English. In Korean, the language is designed that it flows, right? You're not even really listening to the other person. It's like, right? That's how it ends. But in English, our language is so broken up. There's like no rhythm to the way we speak. And so we're constantly pausing and then we're listening to the other person. And it's kind of like this jousting back and forth. And so I've observed that with Korean culture, with Chinese culture, very similar. So what I try to do is I try to really listen when they're praying and you hear the rhythm and then they get to the end of their prayer, right? You go, dun, 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 dun. Amen. That's how it is. But yeah, it's so cool, man.
How committed do you think a leadership should be related to becoming a multi-ethnic church? I think as I think about the conversation that we've had today, I think the future will increasingly be multi-ethnic for sure. But at present, how committed do you think a leadership should be towards becoming a multi-ethnic church? And would that be beneficial, or could there be some costs as well to that?
How committed. There's a commitment to the mission, right? Whether your church transitions to be multi-ethnic or not, I think can be determined by the leadership and by the lead pastor. But we all have to have that mindset of the nations. And so I think we agree on that. We place that aside. But can we truly transition a mono-ethnic church into a multi-ethnic church? And if you are committed to that, that whole Revelations chapter 7, verse 9 picture of every tribe, every tongue, every nation, know that there's going to be tension within the congregation. You see that in Acts when, they were trying to, like, who do we take care of first? You had, the Greeks, and then you had the Jews, and then you had, all sorts of other, Gentiles coming into this mix. And, they tried to protect the status quo of their faith and their religion. And so how do we do that within a multi-ethnic environment? And again, like in our congregation, I'll speak from my context. Like I said, it's kind of like been my R&D department. When we launched Church in the Valley about 7 or 8 years ago, I was committed to really developing a multi-ethnic team, and so I surrounded myself with multi-ethnic leaders. And a part of my personality, Matt, is like I'm entrepreneurial. I want to get going. I'm like the Energizer Bunny. I just bounce, bounce, bounce like a pinball, just going from one thing to the other. And again, I had to understand my leadership style and trying to develop a multi-ethnic team. And then of course, planting bivocational was a challenge. I was working downtown for an inner city shelter. Matt, I don't know if you knew that, but that was stressful. Like that, I was putting in 50, 60 hours a week in that job. And so again, when I'm looking back, I realized, okay, all of these things, what could I have done better? What should I have committed to? And what I probably would have done more of is really spending time with that core team in the very beginning, really developing that multi-ethnic mindset. And again, a lot of this stuff, like the stuff I'm learning now, and we're even talking about this, with our team, like we're just catching up in a sense, right? Like we have a lot of material in the States, but again, the context is so different than it is here in Canada. I've looked at some of the resources that have been suggested to us, but I think in our Canadian context, we're writing it as it's coming. You know what I mean? Like we're pioneering some of this stuff, and so if anything, my experience and the hardships and the pains and struggles that I've gone through over the past 8 years, has helped me to look back in retrospect and realize, okay, this is what I would have done, or this is what I would recommend to the next church or generation that's trying to plant multi-ethnically, and so I would spend a lot more time just developing that multi-ethnic team, and just seeing that just kind of spiral out where you're building this vortex of people that are just pulled into that, as opposed to forcing it, multi-ethnically. So yeah, I think that's something that I would really work on. So one of the things that I've been experimenting with is we have a lot of in the Edmonton area. God's been doing an amazing work, just bringing a lot of ethnic churches. I mean, Edmonton is one of the fastest growing cities, like in any of our major cities here in Canada, but it's bringing in an influx of people and including laborers into the harvest we've been praying for. And so we see a lot of first generation churches. And I'm already seeing, some of the things that we observed, 20 years ago in the ethnic churches that are happening within their own churches. And so I'm able to come in and give them some insight into what will look like to maybe establish a second generation church or develop multi-ethnic mindset where you're sending out people. We're collaborating with different churches. We started something called Impact Studio here. And so we have a bunch of African churches and Asian churches. And I took their young people from their church and I put them together in a group. And we started something called Impact Studio. It's an influencer studio. We started this during the pandemic. Social media is huge, TikTok, Instagram, blah, 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 blah. And, and so there was multiple wins, right? One, we're teaching them music. We're teaching them spoken word. We're teaching them culture. But more importantly, we're teaching them to integrate with one another, accomplishing a task together. And so as they grow, it only becomes natural for them to collaborate, right? So we're looking at the kids, developing them, giving them skills, abilities, discipling them, allowing them to do ministry together. And so we're seeing some of the conception of that already with the collegiate ministry on campus. It's cool. So these kids, they know each other. They're now in university, campus ministry together, and they're doing projects together on campus. And Matt, you've heard of what God's doing on the campus. And again, I think it's them coming together, collaborating together.
Nate, I'm really grateful for you. I'm thankful that you decided to say yes to this podcast. And so on behalf of myself and everybody listening, thanks for taking the time today. Well, friends, I'm sure you'd agree that there is much from my conversation with Nate that could be applied as this episode's action step. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is this. Have a conversation with someone who has a different racial, ethnic, or cultural background than yourself. My hope in having this conversation is that it brought to mind new questions that you've never asked someone before, or maybe it set an example for a way to, in grace and humility, ask questions of somebody else with a different history or background than yourself. This will hopefully inspire you to have deeper relationship with other people, to see difference, and rather than to be walking away from those differences, to ask questions about some of those differences. Once again, in grace and humility, with a desire to build a relationship. Once again, my hope is that this conversation between Nate and I was an example of that. And as I said at the very beginning, in humility, this was not about arriving upon full conclusions, but about engaging and beginning a conversation about how we pursue churches with people of various backgrounds where many nations are represented. Well, friends, as always, I hope this was an encouragement to you. Please go ahead and share this episode, rate us on whatever platform you're using. And now here is a clip from a conversation that will be released next week with Chris Vache.
At a lot of churches, there are some things that we do and we've lost a bit of clarity or understanding on why do we do that, other than we've been doing it for a long time and it seems like it's going good. There are words and phrases that we use that may or may not be understood by people. We may haven't taken time to really define those words, and that could be in a mission statement or in values. And then sometimes there are people who are leading things and we're not sure how aligned they are with the mission that God's calling us to. We're not sure how aligned culturally they are. We're not sure if they're actually helping to move the mission forward or not.